Hello, I'm Alan Davies. I'm an architect and heritage lead at BDP. Welcome to the first ever BDP podcast series. It's called Old Buildings, New Beginnings. In this series, we discuss the current thinking relating to the reuse of old and existing buildings. It's a very current topic. Across the globe, retrofit and refurbishment, rather than demolition and replacement of buildings, has been steadily gaining traction as we seek to reduce our impact on the environment and create better places using buildings and structures that already exist. In 2018, Carlo Elefante, the president of the American Institute of Architects, stated that the greenest building is the one that already exists. We will discuss topics including adaptive reuse, sustainability, accessibility, improving performance, as well as the cultural significance of keeping old buildings. Why build new when you can repurpose the old? Welcome to the conversation. Hello, and welcome to Old Buildings, New Beginnings, where this week we ask the question, can we make historic buildings sustainable? The reuse and adaptation of old buildings has been promoted by a wide range of organizations concerned with sustainability, including the World Green Buildings Council and the American Institute of Architects. Here in the UK, architects and engineers have declared the climate emergency. And fired by the same issues, the Architects Journal launched a campaign in 2019 called Retro First, championing the reuse and retrofitting of buildings over demolition and rebuild. So today we discuss how sustainable can old buildings be and what can we do to adapt existing structures to be more sustainable. Joining me to answer these questions today are three colleagues, Lucy Townsend, sustainability consultant and associate in our London studio, James Hepburn, building services engineer and principal in the London studio, and Testoni, architect director and leader of the heritage team, again in our London studio. Let's kick off by discussing the ways in which historic buildings are sustainable or less sustainable than new buildings. Again, I think this might be best to start with Lucy. This is really about how we measure sustainability. So I'd like to probe that aspect to start with. As a sustainability consultant, what in your views are the ways in which historic buildings are more sustainable?
I mean, when you look at it, the key thing is when you talk about embodied carbon. So I think the fact that a historic building, it is already there, it is already built. So actually, whereas traditionally when we talked about sustainability, maybe even 10 years ago, if you look at energy and carbon, it was all to do with the operational energy and carbon. So, the heating, the lighting, the cooling of that building. But actually now it's become a lot more focused but actually there is a lot of energy and the associated carbon that goes into, extracting materials, production of materials, installing those materials to actually build a building. So in a way you can say, the energy associated with that has already been invested when you look at historic buildings and old buildings. And by that means, they are actually inherently sustainable. And that's something that I think is really important because actually you're not only using, virgin raw materials, but actually you're extending then the life of that building. That maybe, if you're going to talk about demolition and rebuilding, has it reached its end of its life, or is there a way that you can extend the life of that building?
Good, James?
Yeah, I think the key thing is the building has got to be functional. That's the challenge. So there's a lot of buildings out there that may not meet the functional requirements of a client or a user. And if we've got to make that building work harder and be effective, we've got to make sure that any interventions that are made are reflected when you're sort of trying to measure that sustainability, because that does have an impact as well. If you're going to do an awful lot of refurbishment or remodeling of the building, that can have a significant impact. And once you then add that into the potential lesser sort of energy performance over time, you may then have it's a different sort of calculation and a different answer. But the key thing is to be able to measure it, to be able to give clients informed their decision.
There's an additional sort of layer to that, which is working with existing buildings, historic buildings, and often listed buildings. There's also the balance that needs to be struck between the need to reuse, retrofit, the need to be sustainable, which is an agenda that is getting rightly higher and higher. But at the same time, also the need to retain, support significance, not lose significance, balance change. It's a balance. It's a very, very fine balance that needs to be looked at on a case by case basis. And sometimes it's also a bit of a client education process where there are specific brief requirements that would call for certain approaches. But at the same time, other considerations need to be brought in and need to be weaved into the narrative for the project. And that's not always very easy.
I think on that point as well, Illich, it's that kind of balance that we always kind of talk about. I feel like sustainability, sometimes they talk about, just the environmental side of things.
Yes.
But actually, if you're looking at the social side of things, and I think there's probably pros and cons to both of that when you talk about historic buildings. And I think like James said, and you're saying about, meeting the brief is, they tend to be probably not as interactive spaces. You have more cellular spaces. And how does that work for the people in the building? But then also I do think if you look at probably where historic buildings are built, there's maybe a sense of more kind of community, or there's a range of uses. I think it's not just looking at then that building in isolation. It's talking about where that building is located. And I think, is there things around permeability of streets and things of how that's been built, and that has an impact on sustainability as well.
Yeah. And I think most, particularly when we come to our historic buildings, they tend to be at the centre or close to the centre of settlements, and therefore they have better transport communications as well, closer to the community. So there is the social and the economic aspect as well as the environmental. I wonder then, Lucy, if the tools we have for measuring these things capture those benefits of historic buildings or existing buildings sufficiently. There is, for instance, an architect campaigner who believes that the tools don't emphasize embodied carbon, embodied energy sufficiently. And currently our tax system doesn't support the reuse of existing buildings. There's VAT on conversion, whereas there isn't on new builds. So do you think the tools we have sufficiently recognize the benefits?
I think they're getting better. I'd agree. So, I mean, as I said, the fact that we've been measuring kind of operational carbon for so long, I think the embodied carbon side of things is still relatively new. And so at BDP, we use one-click LCA, which is a life cycle assessment tool. It allows us to start quantifying the embodied carbon. And there's various tools out there, but I think, you need to then, those tools could be a bit subjective in the sense that, we will sit there as a team and we'll sit with the architects and engineers and look at the different material build-ups, and we put that into the one-click database. But I think as that database still needs to evolve. So there's still, making sure that we're putting in the right materials, making sure that there's the information for those materials. So sometimes it might just be a standard build-up. Some of them will have, what they call an environmental product declaration, which will go into more depth in terms of what the embodied carbon associated with that material is. But yeah, I still think it's got some way to go before we get some accuracy, I think, in those tools. But I think they're a good tool at the moment, especially at those early options. And as James was saying, around that balance between new versus old, you need to look at the whole picture. So we need to understand what is the embodied carbon and be able to quantify that. But then also balance that against kind of the operational needs. But I would also say the social side of things, I think that's where we're lacking in terms of tools and being able to measure.
I was just going to say, the sort of science, I think the science is there. To a certain extent, is multiplying up quantities and sort of using the sort of carbon impact of that. But the sort of softer side, the social side, is much, much more difficult to sort of measure, and actually it needs to be considered as a whole.
Yeah, I would add there's other aspects to that, to the social economic sustainability, where refurbishment of an existing historic building calls for certain techniques, certain methodologies to be applied, which may have been lost or may lack and may require upskilling of the workforce, may require opportunities for creating or supporting specialist artisan workmanship, restatement of traditional working methodologies. That, I think, it would be helpful if that could also be somehow quantified and recognized in the process, because that's part of the benefits that arise from the refurbishment of a historic building.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that is something, we've been working on Manchester Town Hall, and that's something they've been trying to do, is kind of identify what skills and craftsmanships are needed, but then actually quantify, okay, so has there been apprenticeship schemes that have been set up as a result of that?
Exactly.
Has it created employment within the area? And again, it's being able to kind of get those tangible bits that you can quantify, isn't it?
Yeah. And the Palace of Westminster is another project which is very relevant in that respect. Very good. So it's been said that the greenest buildings are those that already exist, and that's a comforting thought, but probably not one we should be complacent about. So I want to move on now to discuss not just embodied energy and carbon, and no more uptake of green fuels and such on, but also the aspect of energy and use. So the question really is reuse of existing buildings always more sustainable, and where are the limits? And I think I'm going to start again with Lucy on this one, in terms of that balance of embodied energy against energy and use. In your experience, and we'll come to James and Illich, but in your experience, what are the limits here? What are the challenges of using existing buildings, and in what respects are they notably not sustainable?
Yeah, I think it's a good point, and I think that goes back to that thing of the balance between it. I think the issue you've got is, which more kind of historic buildings, is that what are the interventions you can do? If you're starting with a blank piece of paper for a new build, there's obviously a lot more opportunity. So I think that's really where the challenges come. And as I said, but I think there is almost that switch now, that because, the grid's decarbonising, because you've got new building regulations coming in, almost the energy in use is going to be a smaller factor in the whole energy and carbon piece, because there are mechanisms in place that are going to start reducing that impact. And therefore, by a shift of magnitude, your embodied carbon can become more important, because I think James mentioned it, you're having to put in more materials. If you're looking at putting in triple glazing from an embodied carbon point of view, that is worse. I think also we've had projects where, if you're looking at maybe a building that's a bit more cooling led, if you're then starting to only focus on the embodied carbon and you're actually, really thermally insulating that building, actually, are you increasing then your cooling demand for that building? So again, it's just, you can never look at those in isolation. You've got to look at the whole carbon piece, I think. I don't know if James would agree.
That's right.
That's really, really important. I think the sort of the mass and the form of the building can be quite key. If you end up with a very deep plan building that's got lots of people in it, and you're using it as an office, so there's lots of heat being generated from the equipment and the people inside, you then sort of super insulate it because you think it's the right thing to do. Sometimes it isn't, because it's, as Lucy said, it's a cooling led building, and you end up not needing to do that. So it's coming back to thinking about things holistically, and a lot of it comes down to windows. I think windows are so key in buildings. They're sort of the thing that allows the building to sort of be. If it's not got windows, it's a box, isn't it? It's horrible. So those windows are sort of fundamental to making it. You need to. They're a way of controlling the environment. They're the interface with the environment. So as much as you can potentially insulate sort of solid elements of the building, the windows are the really key bits.
And also from a conservation perspective, often they are the easier bits to address as part of the refurbishment, because often you've got existing buildings, listed buildings. Insulating to the outside or to the inside is not possible, not acceptable, or undesirable. The windows can be targeted for specific improvements, which in the example of the old Admiralty building actually did more than one thing. We had the imperative of the environmental control within the building. We had also, very importantly, because of the location, central London location right next to Trafalgar Square, we had a very strict requirement in terms of acoustic control within the space. And at the same time, because it was a government department, we had the requirement for security. And therefore, looking holistically at what we needed to do and how we could bring all these briefing requirements, again, the brief, within the design, in that particular case, the use of secondary glazing was the most suitable way to address every single one of those points. In other instances, for instance, at Somerset House, the East Wing refurbishment that we completed back in 2012, it was agreed that secondary glazing would not be suitable for all sorts of reasons. Clearly, Grade 1 listed building, the level of significance and the level of impact that would have brought would have been completely different. And therefore, a different type of approach was taken where, for instance, the natural ventilation or the mixed mode natural ventilation system was agreed to be more suitable to the needs of the client.
That brings us to a very interesting question, which is relevant to a number of our projects, including again the Palace of Westminster. And I'm going to direct this one at James. It is this constant dialogue and sometimes tension between the principles of sealing the building and saving the energy and sort of recycling the energy from it, and on the one hand, and naturally ventilating on the other. Can you, James, summarize for us what the current thinking is on that from a purely environmental engineering point of view initially, before we go back to considering the implications of that on historic building, which is clearly a section of the whole retrofit building stock?
From an environmental engineering perspective, the optimum ventilation strategy, I think, for a building is a mixed mode ventilation building. I think it's good from a sort of well-being perspective. People like to be in contact with the outside and their environment. It creates a much happier building. But you still have the ability to mechanically ventilate and heat recover and control the amount of ventilation that you're putting into the building. So you can maintain air quality, which is key. It's something that's particularly at the top of lots of clients' agendas at the moment with the sort of current pandemic. Air quality in it and sort of guaranteed ventilation is fundamental. So you can do that with a mechanical ventilation system, but at the same time, if it's done intelligently, the installation should be able to detect that people can open windows, and actually the mechanical ventilation then ramps back, and so you're not in wasted energy. You're allowing that natural ventilation to happen. That's the ideal scenario in a new building. That's what we'll be doing.
And you've described almost word by word what we've done at Somerset House, where we enabled the user to open the windows if they wanted. There's an element of a benefit in enabling that kind of freedom, in enabling that kind of control. But in the technology enabled us to install some sensors that when the windows were open, automatically cut off the cooling or the cooling into the space, which clearly had benefits in terms of less loss of energy by the services working whilst the air is just escaping through the window. And that mixed mode has been a success with the clients, so much that it's been used in other projects by the same client at King's College London. It's interesting because Somerset House was one of the first examples that we know of to achieve BREEAM Excellent rating in a Grade 1 listed building. And that was quite an achievement, but in a sense, it's just the first step, because these are examples that need to be taken and reutilized and used in other circumstances.
Very good. Is there then is there anything else we can do to make our old buildings more sustainable? Is there anything that we've come across in our work where, in addition to the physical measures, for instance, is it about the uses we apply to them? Is it the way we adapt them? Quite a few of the projects from your point of view are actually about adapting buildings to new uses, and that gives them new lease of life, which I think
Yes.
Lucy's already referred to. So that's also inherently sustainable. What about building materials? There's a constant dialogue about the sustainability or otherwise of traditional building materials. Do we have any thoughts about that? This is maybe one for Illich to kick off with.
Yeah. Yes, I think that there's a paradigm in the sense that I think is shifting and needs to shift probably between the significance of the historic building and the importance of how we address climate change, how we address sustainability, how we introduce more sustainability. Building materials can be part of that, but it needs to be supported by the understanding that understanding the building, understanding what those materials are to start with. What are we working with? Because working with a Georgian building is not the same as working with a modernist building. The type of materials, the way the materials behave, the insulation that they provide, the kind of comfort they provide is completely different. And therefore, the introduction of insulation, the introduction of energy, the introduction of other new elements within the building needs to recognize this relative difference. And in the case of existing buildings, particularly more modern buildings, where notoriously the level of for instance, the thickness of the walls reduced dramatically, there is an imperative to rethink how we can address the deficit in the way that these elements behave.
And Lucy, in terms of traditional materials, for instance, masonry or lead on roofs, what's the current sustainability thinking of this? Because I think there is potentially here again a tension between historic traditional methods and the messages in terms of sustainability.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I think there's maybe like 2 points to it. I think there's the fact that actually, well, going back to that holistic thinking, well, how do we, if we've got historic buildings and we've got materials ordered within there, what are the benefits of those materials? So are we saying if there's, can we use high thermal mass of those materials actually as a benefit in terms of the internal conditions? Because actually that's probably better than talking about stripping out these materials and replacing them. I think, again, going back to Illich's point as well of the fact that you have to look at these buildings in isolation, and you can't just start saying, right, let's put a load of timber or bio-based materials into these historic or existing buildings. So I think there's also a piece on the industry and how do we make some of those materials more sustainable. So when we're talking about, concrete, unfortunately, is just a very good material for buildings, not from a sustainability point of view. But the industry is already looking at, okay, well, how do we then make concrete more sustainable? Because actually you're never probably going to get away from using that in some form. So I think there's a bit of a piece around that as well of how we as sustainability professionals and, architects and engineers, how we engage with industry and how we kind of push some of that, innovation and forward thinking around the materials that we can use.
I'm often concerned by one of the elements that racks up the carbon footprint of the construction industry. not only is the creation of the material to build, but also the transport, is the fact that we source materials for construction from all over the place. It's a little bit like going to the grocery and buying bananas from the other side of the world, or indeed apples from South Africa. When UK used to be the orchard of Europe, and how do we translate that into a better? This is a bit of an open question, obviously. A better sort of use and a better knowledge and awareness of the local materials, what is typical of a certain region, which used to be the normal approach in construction.
And Lucy, do the tools allow us to measure that?
So it does look, so the tools will have then, what's your transportation distance and things like that. And that's where it's about kind of the accuracy of the tools, of making sure that the right input put in.
Yeah.
And then making sure that what goes into the design is then delivered and everyone fully understands it from a contractor perspective, because they've got a supply chain and they've got margins they want to make. So that's a real challenge, and that's why sort of the measurement specification and the oversight is absolutely key.
To me, you're absolutely right. To me, that's the one bit that probably as designers we can be in control of, but there needs to be a recognition also on the whole construction chain, that if we specify, because there is a specific reason to specify a specific material that is constructed, built, manufactured in, say, in the UK, there may be a better control over that particular requirement, rather than letting contractors go away and modify that specification because it suits their supply chain, but it actually has a potentially huge impact on the carbon footprint of the construction that's being done.
I also think on the materials, I think there's also an element of, do we need all the materials that we're putting in? I think that's part of the embodied carbon story as well. It's actually, can you just use less?
Yeah.
Still, you still got to think about the function of the space, but I think that's a key element of not just putting materials in, because that's the way we've always done things. And
it comes to looking at materials in a way that, can we use self-finished materials, timber floors? They may have sort of other challenges, but they are pretty hard wearing. They've done really well. Compare that to a carpet you maybe have to change every 8 years, and look at the embodied carbon in that carpet. It's sort of making judgments like that and trying to inform clients that actually an investment up front will absolutely make a difference from a carbon perspective over when you look at it in terms of the full life expectancy of the building.
Very good. I'm going to finish with one question, which isn't scripted, but what does the future look like? What do you think in terms of your personal work and maybe a broader picture? What do you think the future looks like in terms of the adaptation of buildings for sustainability reasons in the UK, in your experience? Village?
So thank you. My view is that it looks better, far better now than it used to, say, 10 or 15 years ago. The sustainability agenda has clearly gone up, and that is positive. I want to use that as a positive opportunity to challenge the way we work, to challenge the way we look at and work with historic buildings, and adapt them in a way that meets the wider agendas that can no longer be ignored. We need to address them. We need to address these issues, and the existing built environment in the UK only is between 20 and 30% of of the whole built environment. So we need to address this with an eye to the bigger picture.
James?
I'm not sure I'm feeling as positive as it is. I think we're getting better at looking at sort of non-residential buildings. I think, there's much more understanding. There's clients that have got different drivers and different pressures to try and reduce the carbon impact of existing estates. Universities have got students that are expecting their university to make an impact in terms of reducing carbon emissions, and wider clients have got other drivers that do it. But a huge amount of the buildings in the UK are residential buildings,
Indeed.
whether they're those that are owner-occupied or not, and they're a real challenge. Trying to incentivize people to invest in something. And interestingly, what's going on in the wider world at the moment in terms of the sort of the terrible things happening in the Ukraine and the sort of fuel crisis that's happening, that may start to drive things differently. And it's interesting. There may be a positive aspect to that. The worry is that they will find other ways, and fracking will start happening, and we'll be dragging more and more fossil fuels out of the earth. But I think that's the real challenge: trying to sort of engage with people who are sort of in charge of the vast sort of majority of the property in the UK is really difficult, because you're looking for them to invest in something that they're not really seeing particularly the benefit from, but it's something we need to do.
Yeah. And final word to our sustainability consultant, Lucy.
Yeah, I'm probably somewhere in the middle, I think. I think I agree, for me, in the last kind of 10 years of my career, I've never seen sustainability so high on the agenda, which is a really positive thing. I think there's a lot of people that want to do the right thing. And I think we're seeing clients, even from if we're talking about existing buildings, I think from a sustainability and possibly the whole thing with COVID, that, clients are looking at how they adapt their existing assets. And does that mean, consolidating? Does it mean repurposing the assets that they've got? I think I agree with James, the challenge that we have in terms of owner-occupied spaces. So if you've got owner-occupied, buildings, it's a lot easier because they're seeing the operational and the cost savings versus, just investing the capital cost and then selling that asset on. I think the main challenge is just that the want is there. I think it's the how to do it and getting over the challenges that come along the way. So I think for me, it's understanding, we need clients that are going to drive it, that there's a clear brief. I think the three things for me is cost, time, and planning, which I'm sure Alan has had conversations before. I think the cost element, there is still this perception that sustainability costs more. And I think that's something that we need to kind of, understand more in the process. I think time, when we talk about designers, I think we're always rushing to deadlines. And I don't think we factor in, when you look at some of the projects we've worked on that are going for net zero, that are going for all these sustainability credentials, you need to build in the time in the programme to actually understand what that means and deliver that. And then I think there's loads of, I think industry and, you think you've got things like the London Energy Transformation Initiative, you've got industry groups that are pushing the sustainability agenda in this sector. But I think the planning side of things, there's still that conflict of when we talk specifically about historic buildings and sustainability. I think there is still a bit of a disconnect, and until we can kind of resolve that, and I know that we do a lot of work obviously in Westminster and they're trying to move forward with that, but you're still coming up against hurdles of when you're trying to make old buildings more sustainable. I think there's got to be the mechanisms in place that then allow you to do that.
Great. Thank you, Lucy. Thank you all three for your insights. I was told recently that an increasing amount of our work as a practice in the UK in particular is on historic buildings. So I'm sure the sustainability aspect will become an increasingly more important aspect of that work for reasons that James outlined just now. Thank you all three.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alan.